Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew Rogers on the Barton organ. Let's give him a round of applause. It's so unique to hear the organ. Thank you. Welcome to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. My name is Mark Jacobson. Today, we present world-renowned architect, designer, and the University of Michigan Taubman College Clipson visiting professor, Sir David Adjaye. Today's event is a co-presentation with the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning with additional support from Knoll Incorporated. Knoll is a constellation of design-driven brands creating inspired, modern interiors that has partnered with Sir David Adjaye on an exclusive collection of furniture and textiles. Please check them out online at knoll.com. That's Knoll.com. Thanks for joining us as well. A big thank you to our partners for making this event possible. As we do not have a regular Penny Stamps event at the Michigan Theater this Thursday, please consider attending a public talk by Philip Tenari on Chinese art taking place this Thursday at 6 p.m. at the Museum of Art in the Helmut Stern Auditorium. Phil Tenari, director and CEO of the Ulen Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, a leading Chinese independent institution of contemporary art, will discuss Chinese art in its global context. Then, please join us here again on Thursday, March 14th at our regular time for a look at Robert Mapplethorpe with Bryce Dessner, the composer and multi-instrumentalist from the band The National, and librettist Cord Arrington Tuttle, the creative team behind Triptych, a world premiere production and UMS co-commission exploring the life and work of Robert Mapplethorpe. You can check out some brochures of the project outside in the outer lobby. There will be no regular audience Q&A today. Instead, today's presentation will be presented to you in two parts. First, with a lecture by Sir David Adjaye, after which the Dean of Taubman College, Jonathan Massey, will join David on stage in public conversation. Now, please remember to turn off your cell phones. Thank you. And now, for some words introducing our guest, please welcome the Dean of Taubman College, Jonathan Massey.
Good evening, University of Michigan, and thank you for joining us here. Tonight, we're here to hear a presentation by one of the world's greatest architects and the founder of Adjaye Associates, a firm based in London with offices in New York and Accra. Sir David Adjaye was born in Tanzania to Ghanaian parents, raised in a few different cities, including London, where he completed undergraduate and graduate degrees in architecture and began his practice career. Adjaye is an especially strong fit to the Penny Stamps lecture series because of his deep and lifelong collaborations with leading artists, curators, and critics, which began in his school years and really shaped the emergence of his practice in London, and a focus on civic and artistic institutions that has manifested itself in the growth of his career ever since. Adjaye is an architect primarily, but he is also a photographer and a furniture designer with an extraordinary creative gift, manifest in buildings, spaces, and other works that are formally compelling, visually compelling, and possessed of a really extraordinary level of facture in his work with materials and with methods of making things, whether you sit on them or inhabit them. He has registered his impact across the world through buildings and master plans, publications, exhibitions at leading museums, teaching engagements at great universities, and awards including his induction into the Order of the British Empire in 2007 and his knighthood 2 years ago. Adjaye is here in part because of a few engagements with Michigan communities that have converged this year. His Well, the first is his work with Knoll, which you have heard a little bit about and which I think you'll see a bit of tonight. Knoll is a company with strong Michigan DNA. It was led and profoundly shaped for many years by Florence Knoll, whose education at Cranbrook launched a career in transforming our offices and homes through furniture and interior design, and Grand Rapids is one of Knoll's key manufacturing sites. In addition, last year, Adjaye Associates, with the landscape architecture firm Michael van Valkenburg Associates, won the commission to redesign the West Riverfront Park in Detroit, part of a series of neighborhood and district transformations that are testing and deploying new strategies to promote an inclusive recovery for our major metropolis. And finally, as the Clipson visiting professor here at Taubman College, Adjaye is co-teaching a course with Associate Professor Katie Newell. The course in advanced prototyping will challenge architecture students to design and prototype facade systems and components, a dimension of Adjaye Associates' work that is especially strong and that aligns with our emphasis on making and fabrication. David Adjaye was previously here in 2012 when he gave the Raoul Wallenberg Lecture. Please welcome back to the University of Michigan, Sir David Adjaye.
Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to be here in this incredible hall with that incredible organ. My God, I've never had an organ start a lecture, so that's definitely a new one. I'm very excited. Let's get this going. I'm going to show you a series of projects to really talk through some recent concerns and some projects that we've completed over the past 5 years. I'm going to share with you a project that we're just completing now, which will open in October, that we just completed in San Antonio for Linda Pace, which is a very special project for us. But I'm going to... Louder? Okay, thank you. I will project. How's that? Is that better? Okay. So, I wanted to start with Knoll. I was very fortunate to be asked by Knoll to be their next studio designer. Knoll has this incredible tradition of commissioning, I think almost every decade, a studio designer who works on a special collection for them. And I was, this decade has been my decade to do this design. And I was, it sort of culminated with the commission of the Smithsonian as a kind of way to focus the idea. And what was very amazing was to work with Knoll's incredible team to develop, essentially in the end, a chair, but as a chair as a system for supporting the body, of course, in repose, in this kind of relaxed space. But for me, the experiment was to see if we could develop a system which could then unfold into two chairs. Just take you down. One where what I call the sort of frame, the structural expression of the chair is manifest as a sort of skeleton, and that was going to be made out of a cast material, and then the skin of the material is applied to that skeleton, thinning it, making it a more complicated hybrid structure, which then creates a plastic chair which has flexibility. So one is rigid and one is flexible. So this idea of a kind of duality became the experiment of the furniture, and was a kind of an amazing opportunity to work with their technical team to really develop this twin, instead of one chair, as sort of this twin chair that would work in these two worlds, one outside or inside, both being able to oscillate between these two spaces. The exoskeleton is not ornamental. It is exactly the expression of all the forces that are traveling through the body when the chair is in that reclining state. So it thickens almost like sort of muscle and bone, thickened to support the kind of mass of the body, and thins as it kind of needs less support. There are a few moments of ornamentation. There are about 4 additions within the V sections, which at the last minute I added to show you then. So there's a little conceit in the form, and in a way that is the only moment of the sort of the intervention into this kind of amazing force diagram as a kind of idea. Anyway, these chairs they're made out of cast recycled aluminium, and then they're coated in either copper or can be coated in, we recently experimented with a really amazing high finish red sort of patina, which was developed for the red auction, sort of almost like a sort of Jeff Koons-like kind of finish, which was really amazing. The system really is in these 2-part casts. It's a 2-part cast. So you have the upper body and then the legs, and then there's a kind of fantastic joint connection that holds them. And the thing is, this sort of ability to make this almost seamless sort of floating sort of gesture with this sort of stable structure was the kind of the enjoyment of the project. And then to see it within context with such great sort of other pieces like Saarinen was kind of incredible. The next piece that I did, after just being asked to make a chair, I made a series of pieces, and they were incredibly generous to go with me on this, was to make another structural form, which was a coffee table. And the coffee table was this idea of seeing if one could work with a material to just deform the material and to use that deformation to create a structural beam, an arched beam, but also to create a kind of a reflecting form that would, for me at that time, I was sort of very interested in the way in which material obviously captures light and refraction and reflection, especially working on the museum. And the building, the sort of the 4 pieces of metal sort of joined together in the 4 corners with this bar kind of jointing system coming together would create this polished interior, polished bronze interior, and this very rough sand-cast exterior. The 4 beams, as it were, coming together, almost kind of showing their tension and their form as a kind of visible system to you from above, and that becoming the sort of the delight of the form. Something that you really see when you come on top of the table and perceive it, but this thing being a kind of almost like a small piece of architecture that sits within a sort of domestic space or commercial space. And then finally, the last piece was to make a sort of 2-piece reclining, not reclining, a sort of sofa seat that is made from a series of sort of generated sort of triangles that come together to create a sort of parametric sort of sitting chamber. Its outer shell is a sort of hard surface. Its inner shell is a soft, upholstered section. It looks incredibly rigid, but it's really this kind of form of the body in recline, frozen, but then this kind of soft interior, but looking as though it's rigid. You think the chair is uncomfortable, but it's actually incredibly comfortable. It's based on the economics of lots of sort of sofas that we were able to analyze. So it really kind of learns from the data of how the history of chairs have evolved. And then we sort of developed also a kind of comforter with it, so that it has a sort of footrest that can also become a bench that also works with the same idea. And the sort of monolith quality of the sofa, of this the armchair, is there's a kind of trick in it whereby when you sit in it, you suddenly realize that you can rotate round in it. It kind of swivels on its base very, very easily. So it's a kind of chair that kind of swivels, even though it looks like it's a kind of monolithic form, and it's very it's very easy to do. So it becomes a kind of this sort of simple rotating form. And then we sort of made with it a coffee table sort of addition. So it becomes this kind of triptych, and in a way, really learning again from the Saarinens and this idea of a kind of their sort of version of the late 20th century grand comforter, but this sort of 21st century kind of sort of set that is both a stool, an armchair, a coffee table, working as a compositional family with these kind of possibilities, was really the sort of the test for the project. I wanted to put that in the background for you because, in a way, doing furniture or doing buildings, there's always a kind of clear concern about the way in which one is working with the program, working with the materiality, working with the way in which the architecture is expressing itself, or the form or the furniture is expressing itself within its context and what it's doing. A project I want to move to that we just completed is a really amazing client who sadly passed away when I got the commission, and it's taken over a decade to realize this project. And the person is this incredible woman called Linda Pace from San Antonio, and I met her, this is sort of in 2008 or 9. This was almost the first time I met her, where she came to visit a project that I was completing in London called Rivington Place, one of my first large public buildings at that time in London. And she commissioned me to build her foundation space, her arts foundation space, but shortly after commissioning me, sadly passed away. And the formation of a board and a trustee group and all the kind of various things to kind of make the project happen meant that it delayed for almost a decade, and we just, in the last year, completed it. So the project is in San Antonio in Texas. Those of you who may or may not know San Antonio, an incredible place in the desert with this incredible river that is really the heart of the organization of the city. And the project is at the edge, not in the center, the edge of the city. And it really is essentially an exhibition chamber. She really dreamed of something she called a ruby city, something that she wanted to, she wanted a kind of, a space where her collection could be rotated, a very condensed small building. It's not a large building, but a space where a certain archetypal set of spaces would exhibit her collection. Her collection is a 20th century, sort of late 20th century, early 21st century collection, and would sort of celebrate that. She had set up a foundation called Art Pace, which had enabled an incredible studio practice to happen, where she was the foundation was patronizing artists to be able to kind of have residencies in the city, to be able to understand San Antonio, its incredible heritage, its colonial heritage, its native Indian heritage, and its modern heritage, and to kind of enjoy the kind of landscape of the city as part of the inspiration for an artist that was developing. So the two things would become sort of twins, the showing space for the collection, and then the sort of studio program that was happening in the city. Some of the inspiration when I was there, and some of the things I became very sort of moved by, are obviously the sort of the native architecture, and this idea of a kind of earthbound architecture, and these kind of incredible geometries, and the sort of incredible structures of the sivus, and all the kind of the sort of narrative of sort of the native Indian narrative of the sky and the earth, and the kind of the journey between the two sort of was very, very sort of powerful to finally kind of be in a space where one could learn about those things. And of course also the colonial language of, you know, the sort of missionaries and the sort of monasteries as these kind of worlds that were created to occupy a sort of a missionary group who were able to do their work in that community, and the sort of architecture of those forms and how they were placed in those contexts. And really kind of between these two seeming contradictions, because one, you know, supplanted the other, these two contradictions, we're really trying to find a way to kind of understand how to make a very modest project have the sort of depth to kind of reach towards those things, not in any mimetic way, but to somehow feel a sort of a kind of a way in which the architecture has a complexity because of the kind of extraordinary history of the place, and not to just make it a construction of a building just as is. The site is right on the industrial edge of the city, and it was just here. This is an old ice warehouse, really just a sort of storage building, post-war storage building for storing ice, and that's the site that she'd bought. What was amazing about it is that it connected to the creek which was the River Creek, that sort of ran all the way through to this part of the city. So this is the side here, this is the creek edge. And what's amazing is this is the creek that goes into the city and becomes the kind of very bucolic, very celebrated San Antonio sort of waterfront creek. And the city realized that this, as the city's grown, that this water creek, as this aspect, would become something that they would redevelop, creating all the kind of stormwater kind of management and edge walls. And then we talked to them about creating an amphitheater, a kind of way in which the building could kind of engage with the water and create a whole ecology that can connect back to the old city. It's just sort of views again of the site. So it's really this kind of this pavilion, or this, I call it a little temple to art, that is to kind of occupy this industrial edge. Still a sort of part industrial landscape that's in transition, lots of new housing, sort of warehouses being converted, etc. She had created a garden just next door, which I'll show you, a sort of an artist garden dedicated to her son, who tragically also passed away. So a kind of very sort of tragic story, but one which has a kind of an incredible providence of the city, because the collection is now a kind of incredible resource for the city and this waterfront. Linda Pace was also an artist. She was a collector, but also an artist, and created incredible works and created collaborative pieces. Towards the end of her life, she started to make these red drawings. Those of you who know about dreams, crabs, and sort of cities. This became the kind of sort of very fascinating drawing for me, which was for me her hybrid between the sort of Pueblo sort of architecture and the sort of colonial monastery architecture fused into a system of a kind of base sort of skyline form. And I became very fascinated about that drawing, and seeing if that drawing in a way encapsulated all the thoughts that I was having, and in a way also became a kind of device for thinking about how the project could work. So her collection spans a lot of conceptual and time-based work, paintings, etc. Really some of the key, strong early 21st century sort of artists and late 20th century artists. And this is that drawing that she kind of made with this sort of form. I obviously wanted to make this building, but obviously it's not a Pueblo and it's not a missionary. It's, at the same time, it is a space for art. So being fascinated by this notion of this incredible history of what I'm calling material relationships, one, to kind of cultural narratives, wanted to see if we could also kind of enjoy those motifs and those profiles, the idea of a kind of silhouetted architecture, but also think about the collection, which is basically spanning late 20th century to the 21st century, and see if we could also talk about the narrative of the collections of art from an art production and art spaces. This idea of a building which would also encapsulate within it the spaces in which the kinds of art that are in the collection would have been made in. And I sort of, in the end, going through many options, sort of settled on three forms, and the three forms became about really looking at three. In the end, it started off as a large complex building, but it sort of boiled down to three archetypal spaces. The converted barn. They call it the sort of converted barn with a kind of articulated roof. The studio building, the purpose-made studio building with its clerestory form, and then the factory, the conversion factory, which is the kind of the space of conceptual artists from Judd, etc. So in a way, almost mapping a sort of narrative of three topologies of space that created the sort of some of the contemporary art that we're talking about as a kind of frame also for the collection, became the way in which the building also then sort of unfolded. So it's not only is it working hard across the narrative of the place, but it's also trying to kind of work within the context of the collection, a narrative about the period of time that the collection was also made. The building in the end is these three volumes elevated on a podium with two cantilevered spaces, two cantilevered truss spaces that really hold the circulation stairs that bring you into the spaces. And in a way, like a sort of pavilion, the circulation stairs work to bring you up into the spaces. I'll show you the plans in a second, in through the circuit and bring you down, almost kind of creating a sort of monastic loop through the three systems. And as you sort of move through the form, you engage with these very precise aperture windows that look to very specific narratives, which I'll show you. And then as you move into the spaces, you engage with particular sort of zenithal sort of oculi in the sort of roof profiles, whether through clerestory or skylight or window, to create the atmosphere of each of the spaces. And then this is kind of a moment where you see the two cantilevers that bring you round. So this is the beginning of the journey round, and then the ending of the journey back to the moment. So this idea of making also a kind of building where the circuit brings you through a complex narrative and then brings you back to the same point and then exit. So in a way, almost asking you to either repeat or to disengage, but to kind of shift it from this idea of being a building which has a beginning and an end, but one which is a kind of loop of opportunities and experiences that you could take again and again. So this is the plan of the building in its context. That's the river right here, and the form here. And the sort of building has these chamfers that shift away from the facade and create these relationships. The three volumes are in here. The ground plane is this is the site. This is the kind of landscape of the sort of form going eventually to the water. This is a phase 2, which is going to be done now. We've just completed up to this point here. But essentially, a plaza is created to the waterfront, which can then be activated when the waterfront work is done. The building collects you into it with back of houses and sort of loading facilities, offices, and then there's a sort of public sculpture garden, which is just off to the side, which makes a relationship to the building. And as you go into the building, you kind of go through a sort of a raised portico, which is a device to darken, to change the retina of your eye, to obviously shift the light levels, and I'll show you that. It really is a dark space to allow your eyes to open, and then you come into these light-filled spaces, and then you come up into the gallery. You can go through a sort of giant elevator. You can come and go through an elevator or go through the stair loop into the spaces. These are the offices on the side, and then the loading docks in the back. And then really these three archetypal rooms up. The first window, which connects to the garden that she made for her son, which is a kind of almost a memorial space in the building. The first room, which is the converted sort of barn, which is folded, with off that a second lens which looks over the sculpture court, and then the second room, which is the clerestory, and the clerestory with a little sort of moment that overlooks the stair and connects back to this window, and then the third room with the very large window to the river, which has no pitch at all. So it's two pitched systems and a flat system here in the core, being the central circulation that you go through, and then the staircase that takes you down to that beginning and brings you back up again. The building is built. I literally wanted to work with this idea of, looking at her reaction to red. It brought me back to the native Indian and this idea of a kind of earth-based architecture. So I really loved the idea of seeing if we could make an architecture which sort of somehow reflected the sort of iron-rich color of the earth, and to use that, obviously, to move it up into a kind of coloration that is more saturated. But this idea of creating a datum of it's a masonry precast system which has a kind of smooth terrazzo-like finish on the base and then a more rough finish above. And in a kind of response to her, to make it so that the building has this quality that engages with the light. So we put in a glass aggregate into the precast that sort of catches the light, so that it has this kind of incredible luminosity. But the way in which the building is a kind of as you move around it, this is from the back, you see how it's almost like a series of different elevations that are coming together, almost not wanting to resolve itself, but to create a kind of composition that just rotates as it creates different elevations. This is the elevation to the courtyard. Always this datum carrying through and creating the two sort of spaces. Then the front with the sort of entrance window. And then the sort of cross sections through it. This is looking at the clerestory studio. This is the pitch studio, and then the staircase that's coming down. And then this is the kind of main sort of gallery one, the sort of converted barn, which tilts to create a kind of light scoop into it. In the end, we worked with an incredible team in Mexico who were able to kind of get us this incredible saturated concrete. Getting concrete so that it doesn't fade, the color doesn't fade, is a kind of very difficult thing. And we were able to find these incredible Mexican craftsmen who were able to do it. We were very excited to be able to polish the stone and get us the reflection and refraction. There were many studies to get it right. And in the end, the sort of palette of the same materiality, blasted, aggregated, etc., or coated, etc. I always love to start with this because this is from the highway, and this is our building right here. And this is a kind of typical mall, a hotel, sort of hotel stop. And then you sort of come in and the building in its context, sort of by the river, and waiting for the second part to occur. And from the car park behind, it's looking over the wall, the sort of courtyard, sculpture court that we made. And then in the context of the city, this is from Chris Park. So this is the garden that she made for her son. And this window is the kind of peeking window that connects you back to it, and so for people to see it, and for you to be able to sit here as a bench spot, to be able to look back at it. And then as you come up the street, the building in its context. And as you come round, sort of turn that pulls you in. Sort of a close-up by it. So this is the polished terrazzo and then the rough aggregate. And then you sort of turn into the space where you suddenly enter the space where the materiality is it's a kind of absolute homage to the kind of, the sort of raw, sort of iron-rich sort of minerality of the region. So you come into a ground which is trying to kind of bring you back to that idea of the earth again. And this building built, it's a 21st century building, but it's kind of making these relationships. And this very kind of sort of awkward, I call it a shy building. It sort of doesn't want to show you its face. It sort of has this sort of hand trying to say, don't look. And sort of details of how we sort of create these moments. And so there's that fold that comes around. And then you sort of have this dark space that you suddenly see underneath, and you're invited to come under it. The San Antonio sun is very, very strong, so it's a very sort of powerful moment. And then you sort of come under it, and you have this sort of void that you have to enter. It's red completely through, so it feels very dark to begin with, but it forces your eye, your pupils to open. And you're given a bit of relief, because just as you enter, you realize there's this oculus in the center, which gives you this kind of moment where you have these sort of optics that are just playing with the way in which sunlight is coming down onto you, and then sort of helping your retina to sort of readjust. And then you come into a very simple sort of reception area, still keeping the tonality coming through before you enter the sort of white space. And then you sort of enter the white space, and then you sort of rise up the sort of precast concrete stair with one zenithal light to get you up to the first spot. And then at that spot, you get to that first window with a very low sort of gaze, which connects you back to the park that we were looking at. And this is this kind of moment. This connects you back to the park, but also to the city. This is also the moment where you have this incredible view to the skyline of the city. And then as you look back from that space, the stair you've been in, you can get a glimpse into the first gallery. And so the first gallery sort of is this pitched sort of form with this fold to open up as a sort of zenithal light to come through. The zenithal light floods the space with daylight, but also can be just neutralized to just be a kind of neutral space, so the blinds can black out to make it a neutral space. And then you sort of find the 3 volumes that are being articulated, the 3 rooms articulated in the one junction, where you're able to kind of go to all 3 spaces through this kind of moment. When you come through from the first space, there's a second window which invites you to look over the sculpture court, and you have this incredible Nancy Rubin sculpture with this eyelid, and this juxtaposition with the cast for me is really beautiful. She assembles this sort of engines that almost seem to elevate, almost kind of speaking about the kind of production or the production of the 20th century, and this idea of kind of the sort of excess of the 20th century, and this is sort of very beautiful relationship. And then the park, which will then allow for other sculpture to be placed in, etc. Then the second gallery with a very high wall at the end with a clerestory, sort of an industrially screened clerestory, which creates a space for large installations to be installed. The way in which the architecture is working is that it's always, the walls go straight down to the ground, and there's a kind of reveal slot, so that there's never the sense that the walls are weight-bound, and then we deal with all the air conditioning by making a series of reveals that actually hide the ducting. So all you see are the lights and the monolithic nature of the walls. So there's a kind of primary nature to the space. And then that junction where you get the three sort of doors in. And from that clerestory space, this is the second sort of space that comes off it, which lets you see people coming up and also see through to the view to the outside. And then through another side space, which then brings you into the third volume, which is this room with these 2 large windows, which overlooks the sort of industrial landscape, but also really overlooks the waterfront. And this space, which is the only space which a flat roof allows for video work to be projected, or for work that's not light-sensitive sculpture, etc., can be displayed here. And as you come close, you kind of get this relationship to the water when that's going to be finished and the enclosure. And then sort of looking back. And then down from there, the staircase, and to that window that you started at. So you'll see people coming back as you start, and there's this sort of the idea of the loop. And then that window to see people coming and you arriving and leaving. And that sort of moment where the 2 worlds, all the worlds are sort of colliding in this kind of moment. And then from there, you can go into the sculpture garden, the garden sort of space with the Nancy Rubin sculpture. And it's the one moment where we use the kind of reflective glass because of the garden, wanting to reflect the garden back in the building. And then there's this sort of extraordinary walls that we made with cantilevered, they're sort of cantilevered with no joints, so the sun hits it, and you get these incredible lines that just pierce. There's no connections through them, and it makes this beautiful sort of series of lines across the space. And then so that's the space which does it, depending on where the sunlight is, and then that's a kind of terrace space for it. And then the interiors, this sort of monolithic concrete table framing this view. I mean, I hope you can see it, but in the light, it actually totally sparkles. We usually have a video, but I didn't load it up this time, but you get these are these kind of reflective moments, and it literally twinkles as you move around it. The building sort of twinkles, which really sort of surprised a lot of people. Okay, then number 2 case study, which is Sugar Hill. Sugar Hill is a project that we completed it's our first big housing project in the US, and it's in New York, and it was a project for us that was about creating a new housing type in the city at that time. We had an amazing client who was very interested in dealing with housing for the poor, but predominantly homeless housing. And for me, this reading of this architecture of the poor, which is kind of encased in Moses' sort of very insensitive sort of infrastructure studies that created almost these apartheid ghettos from the kind of city, sort of in the name of modernity, but actually creating these kind of very strange juxtapositions and this kind of idea of the city with these very unequal parts, but somehow trying to stitch together and create a landscape was something that we were sort of very interested in looking at. And this idea of homelessness, when at that time there was a lot of money in the city and this boom in the city, and this idea that somehow homelessness was actually increasing, but it was just becoming more invisible, was something that Ellen Baxter and her team were incredibly sensitive to understanding, and were able to then be very smart about marshalling the city to get tax credits, to buy homes, and to create sort of dignified homes for homeless people right inside communities. This is Ellen Baxter, an incredible woman who really is the sort of spearhead behind this. She brought us in. This was their first new build project, and it was to be, sorry, just go back a second, a new build project in Harlem. It's on 155th, sort of on the eastern side. And what was kind of amazing was that they were able to get an amazing bit of patronage by getting a private sector sort of patron to buy the land for them, and then they were able to then leverage getting tax credits from the city to then put together this project to make a 125-unit housing sort of building, which would then be, again, using other funding strategies, bring into it a creche for children, and also a storytelling museum that we helped them develop. And then also to, in the development of the project as we got it, we developed a plaza for market farm, so an urban market, a sort of a farmer's market to be able to come to use the space in front of the building to create a sort of public plaza for the community, and also to allow potentially urban farming to happen on the roof by getting a variance with the city to allow us to create a sort of an ecology. The building is in Sugar Hill, Harlem, and I always love the slide because 200 years just before this was Harlem, which is really hard to believe, that sort of upper part of Harlem. And this is Harlem, obviously, now. And the site is here, which is an amazing old sort of neo-Gothic car park that Duke Ellington apparently used to park his car in for forever, with these sort of mansion blocks and sort of incredible housing that's sort of dealing with the negotiation of the neighborhood. We had a very, very low budget for this project, and so I wanted to work within that sort of very low cost, but to find a series of systems that would start to create the specificity of the project by understanding its context. This is an important sort of reference point, but also this idea of doing something that would counter this sort of ruthless, slightly brutal, sort of regimented, slightly prison-like architecture, which I really wanted to move away from. But we're in this kind of budget frame. So here we are at that budget frame, but trying to see how we can also make a different language that would counter that. So we're not in this budget frame, but we're in this context, but we're in this kind of budget number. And how do you make an architecture in that? And obviously this is an incredible place which was a kind of immigrant ghetto that spawned some of the most creatively powerful moments in 20th century American history, specifically African-American history, sort of intellectuals and musicians and thinkers and writers, etc. So there's a kind of backdrop to that, and I always like to kind of pull that into the way we're thinking about the way in which the building was to be made. The site is right on this urban block, which is a tapering block which ends with our sort of block. It has a grade change of about 20 feet from one end to the other. So we created the entrance on this side of the road and created the plaza here by kind of giving a bit of our land to the city, who owned a bit of land next door, to allow them to put their parking. It's the sort of one of the agencies in the city to be able to put their parking so that we could take this instead of coming off the street on the front. Sort of a kind of very important early sketch was this idea of could we make these very efficient buildings, but stack them and create these public moments that would kind of create these lenses to the city, and see if we can articulate a plaza would create a sort of landscape and a sort of generosity to the front. What we ended up with is a kind of a very sort of cost-effective building with very small cantilevers, which are expensive, these moments, and offsets. And then to create, because of the grade change, a whole underworld, which became the courtyards for the nursery, which was at the sort of most privileged point. We were able to put it at grade because the site dropped away. It meant that people couldn't look through because the street would descend away. And then to bring light down into museum space, et cetera, and have parking and commercial spaces off that. The plan is very simple. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but essentially a 3-bar system which allows for creche to wrap around the key facades, residences to be in the center, and museum to wrap around the second half. As you go down, the museum, and as you go up, the housing, which is off a simple double-ended corridor with a series of bays that create a series of variations in each of the units, so that each unit is slightly different, and creates a series of conditions where you get these side views to the East River, which we thought was really important. And then as you go up, you have public program that have these terraces that kind of allow these vistas and views, and then the housing sets back. Made a decision to make it out of precast concrete, again, and to create a series of different windows, different modulations. We could have made them all the same sort of regimented window system. We chose a series of 3 or 4 window systems, 2 different sort of plain sort of sizes, kind of a split system, and a small sort of picture window, and wanted to kind of create a composition that would shift and be much more soft as you went round. On the party walls, because these were the sort of end gables, these were our party walls, you didn't need, these were just corridors and then sort of rooms that didn't need, we really, didn't need to put windows in because technically somebody could build against them. So we used the most minimal windows, but wanted to create a kind of field across the elevation to express the silhouette. So the silhouette of the form really, and the program of the form being very clear. And then the most amount of money was spent on getting the glass for the sort of public areas, which is the upper space up here, and then the children's creche here. And as you go around, this is the entrance of it. And then the precast, we sort of looked at ways of being efficient with the way in which we build, but we wanted to get, basically, in the end, we went for a prefabricated precast system that would have an indented motif that was to do with the kind of context and the landscape, really trying to understand this rich heritage, which is the heritage of the city, especially of Upper Harlem. I mean, this is Louis Sullivan, which is lower down the city, but this idea of a kind of foliage in architecture, but obviously we can't afford this, but we wanted to learn from this. And really just learning things, simple things about the, the early picture I showed you about the farms of Harlem and the rose farms particularly that were up in this neighborhood. I became very kind of intrigued by this idea of a rose motif and whether we could use the rose in a sort of an embossed system into the concrete. So we developed a way in which we would optically kind of shift the density of roses to then create a kind of texture. And this texture would be not sort of cut. So it's not really rose patterns, but it's actually a series of indentations that are cut through a sort of form liner, which optically come together to make you think you're seeing roses. But it's a series of deformed indentations, which creates this, this pattern on the concrete. The building in its context, over here, sort of finishing that triangular block. And within its sort of urban context, so this public sort of terrace, and then the sort of form of the building. The urban gardens are up here with this sort of lift overruns that we're allowed to do. And then within its context here, literally the facade of the building is a direct sort of takeoff from this building, which really broke the sort of, what would be a sort of terrace wall with this staggered section. And I wanted to see if I could make clues to the building through its neighborhood by literally taking direct references. So this becomes the way in which the monolithic plate is then broken up. So it literally becomes this kind of broken form, which kind of breaks the monolithic facades and creates this kind of sort of exaggerated compressed terrace out of this sort of monolithic block and creates this relationship to the water. And then this sort of clear story, the clear sort of plate of the creche with the new plaza garden. Sort of close up, you see how the sort of facade in the light picks up the pattern. The pattern disappears when the light is directly on it and becomes much more strong as the kind of, obviously the angle of the light strikes the facade. So you get more density or less depending on how you're seeing it and what time of the day. So the building is registering the light sort of continually. And when you're sort of close up, you can see the sort of way in which the indentation system works and how it sort of optically starts to come together to make your eyes see it in a new way. This is the sort of building facade with the plaza. This is sort of early photos before the planting sort of taken grapes. It's really sort of growing now. This is the sort of glass front. And this is a kind of great moment where the urban farm, by making the plaza, we were able to encourage this to happen so that this homeless housing would not be a stigma in the community, but actually this space would become a community center with the sort of storytelling museum, the creche, and these markets and events that happen, something that would be seen as a kind of negative in the community. And when we were building it, a lot of the sort of middle class sort of residents didn't want this to happen, didn't want it to be colored black, et cetera, all the usual things that one encounters happens. And the neighborhood chose the color. We actually gave the neighborhood 3 colors. We gave them cream, brown, and black, and they all chose black, which was a fascinating social experiment. What's beautiful is that the creche has these fantastic views over their community, but you can't see them. The kids can't be looked at, which is one of the difficulties with sort of glazed creche spaces that are not protected. So they really grow up seeing their city and engage with their city, which we thought was very important, that young children are actively connected to the world around them, but also protected. We went to Italy to look at Reggiano and developed furniture, and bought furniture, but designed furniture specifically to kind of really help with the teaching program. This is like a potty training bathroom, which connects two classrooms so that teachers can look over and see the kids working it out. I have young kids, so this is very important stuff. So the courtyard spaces with little gardens that can allow teachers and classrooms to overlook play spaces that are safe. And then sort of screen spaces between, so play space could be behind here, and this is a courtyard for the museum, so that there's this layering of spaces that sort of happen sort of behind the building's sort of facade. And then you sort of go into the museum space, which is a children's storytelling museum. As you go down, you see the light chimney that brings light down 40 feet into the sort of depth of the plan. And this is just literally drawing light from a flat skylight right down into the spaces. And as you arrive in a storytelling museum, it's essentially a large space with a collection and also mural walls that allow for artists to do 6-month or 1-year sort of commissions that storytelling is kind of done around. And then so you look at a collection, and then you look at how artists make work and narratives are done from that. And then you have a workshop space where this is where the light chimney falls in, where you have a series of classrooms just behind the exhibition space for teaching labs and an artist in residence who works with the kids. So from inside that, so this is sort of deep inside that 40-foot space that you're down, the light is falling right down, and so you get no sense that you are in such a kind of dark space because it's bright, and then you have these sort of little breakouts areas where you can take kids to talk, to do one-on-one things or discuss things if they're not performing well, etc. We sort of developed a stage within the sort of exhibition plan that can allow for them to make performances, to have large sort of gatherings, etc. And then the collection space, which is connected next to that, and the Studio Museum gives a part of their collection to this museum, being in Harlem, where they rotate a yearly collection of work for this institution, which has been a kind of very nice way in which these institutions have folded with each other. This is the entry that you come into the building, so you look down into the collection space and look down into the other spaces that you're coming in. And then the residences are off this walnut-lined, sort of very small corridor into these very dark, sort of tapering spaces, which then open up into the residential space with the windows, which have these fantastic views over the city. It's a very simple spec, which is really the most important thing was to try and get things like wooden floors in and open up kitchens so that they're open plan, etc., and create the sort of, the sort of sense of light and space in the units. This is obviously the IKEA fit out. And then we have, the sort of musician who, has had all this stuff in storage, having his home for the first time. Musicians are some of the most difficult sort of parts of our society, as they get older, who fall out of the system and need this sort of low-cost housing or support housing. So this is his own photo that he sent to us, so we didn't take the photo. And then the community rooms with their terrace, we sort of arranged for planting to happen. Ellen is a keen sort of planter, so she wanted to put plants everywhere, which we loved. And this has fantastic views over to the East River. And then sort of looking at the section of the building with this is the kind of light chimney system, which draws light right down into the section, and then the way in which the fold happens, and then the building in its context in the evening. So that's the great change that kind of allowed this whole section to happen. I've got 2 more projects, if you can bear with me. I think I'm pushing you over the time limit, but I was a bit late, sorry. So if that was a project about low cost, this is a project about middle to upper sort of income housing, and it's in downtown. This is obviously the bottom of Manhattan to the 2 bridges. 3 or 4 bridges can be seen from the side of the East River. We're in the old part of the city where the origins of Manhattan started on 130 William Street, which is the boundary of the city, sort of here. So this is the old Fort line of Manhattan before it sort of, you went out. We sort of forget how Manhattan expanded, and this was really the port where everything was happening. So we're here. And we've been commissioned to create, this is obviously the city now, create a sort of residential tower in this context. And wanting to kind of work with sort of, after doing something which was about super low cost, this was not about super high cost, but it was about also making a kind of a desirable middle to high end, not luxury, but middle to luxury, but not super luxury, middle to high end sort of housing scheme where sort of middle class starter professionals could get units at affordable prices, but also can allow for sort of penthouses that are much more expensive. I sort of became very fascinated by seeing if we could make a kind of counter, but also sort of similar sort of narrative where we would use the same material as we used in Sugar Hill, but now we would shift the system again. And this time the references would be to the original idea of this masonry sort of edge, stone sort of fortification edge of the city, which then becomes this architecture of sort of very deep masonry sort of plan, sort of urban areas. This part of the city is so dense because of its medieval plan that you have very little sort of light sort of opportunities from the public street. Sort of the pavement is very delineated, traffic is hard. It creates a kind of beautiful canyon, but then we wanted to see if we could make a building which could be a little bit more generous, kind of allow more generosity. So we looked at ways in which we can make a building which sits within this context, understands this masonry architecture, understands the roots of the city and this area as also as the port's developed, the architecture of that area being about sort of storage buildings sort of on the river, and to see if we could make a new sort of 21st century building that would sort of understand these sort of very disparate forces, but try to kind of synthesize them into an idea of a new type of housing scheme. So we talked about how the synthesis of those forms did manage to work in through the neoclassical in its sort of fantastical senses sometimes, but still this idea of a kind of masonry sort of architecture that sort of was purveying, and then this idea of the roots of that architecture going right through to Europe, of course, and then this idea of the second idea of this idea of what happens in Midtown, which are these beautiful pocket parks that can happen that allows the density of the city to be mitigated, to see if we could bring this narrative down to downtown, even though it was a medieval sort of quarter where art and nature could be enjoyed. So the sketch of the building was to say, from the urban line, which is really hard, could you puncture a new urban room and then fold the tower, let the tower be almost sort of uncomfortably sort of pushed back as far as possible to create as much space for the garden plaza as the entry sequence, and then to use that. So the tower really is a kind of bent L-shaped form rather than an urban block sort of sitting here. And it sets back and creates this kind of plaza and then allows that to then become this masonry sort of form that sort of looks at its context. Some of the early studies about how to kind of create this masonry shift. This is really looking at how the sort of geometry really pushes back to create as much space as possible. That's how they form. And then in the end, the tower is this L-shaped form, and then this plaza with gardens, these potted gardens. And then it's a series of plates with a central core here that distributes a series of units in different sizes with the ability to have east and west, elevations, and north and south incredible balconies. In the end, the building so that's the kind of plaza, the sort of building sort of becomes this a different expression of arches, all sort of responding to their context, in a sense. The three elevations have smaller apertures, generally, but on the top where they become balconies, we sort of expanded them. But on the north, you have these very large sort of apertures, really sort of registering this northern aspect, and to use the fold to kind of deal with the way in which sunlight and sort of services, etc., are sort of articulated. I have to keep going faster, sorry. This is a sort of model of the building, sort of looking at the way the sort of plaza works, and then the form, and then a kind of the plant room sort of celebrated in that sort of New York way. We were lucky enough in this project to do, without too much money, but with a lot of effort, just to create everything for the building. We wanted to create a sense that design wasn't just about money, but also about thought. So everything from the way in which the stone that we selected, the way in which the things like the faucets, I designed a kind of whole range of faucets for it, to kind of create a kind of an identity in metal and glass was very important in it. And then in this time, with the precast, we worked with a company in Canada who did the, not this particular company, but it was a Canadian company that did the Sugar Hill housing, to develop a new facade system where we wanted to use lava stone, a sort of much more porous, deep texture. I was really interested in the way sunlight would strike this facade, the facade of this building, as it was going to be this kind of very tall marker, this almost obelisk-like marker, but the way in which it would have a kind of deep richness in the facade, but then the reveals would be smooth. And working with this incredible company, they were able to kind of create this incredible texture for us, where we're able to create these. This is just literally a shot of them stacked. I just came in close to it, but where you get this very sort of textured and then smooth form which is really between these two worlds as the kind of facade system of the entire building. So between the sort of negative louver to the sort of smooth form. And then this is the tower in its context. You see this kind of moment where the erosion happens and then the tower sits within the context of the city. Looking back the other way, you get different types of precasting at the lower level, sort of more polished, and then a rougher texture. And then each tier is tapered very subtly to allow the light again to capture, to be caught across it, to kind of create this shadow. And then as you come down to the lower level, it just cuts and creates opportunities for cafes and entry, etc. These are kind of very brochure images, but I'm sort of showing you this sort of the glossy brochure image that we have to do. So coming right into the lobby, etc. We designed everything, so there's a kind of basketball court in this building. It's like a temple basketball court. And a children's court with different sort of spaces. And then we sort of made this elevated pool sort of space, which is a series of plunge pools and a main sort of swimming pool, a spa, which is expressing these vaults with this black tile, which then creates this kind of moment where you're able to have this incredible relationship to the city. So this sort of using the form and using the language, we're able to kind of pull through and express the whole experience of the building through this kind of idea of the research and where the research takes us. And then in the main spaces, we're able to do things like have sort of certain penthouses which are not about the exaggeration of the plan, but by just simply removing the slab and registering it, and having these double height spaces or terrace spaces, etc. or a very standard unit still having two sets of windows, you know, the large windows, smaller windows, being able to frame the city in different ways. And then this idea of this balconies, being able to kind of have these relationships to the water, that have these kind of very large rooms. I think I have vertigo, so I'm terrified of balconies, so, so I can't really make exterior balconies. And then this relationship to the city. And then the way in which those then create these kind of moments with the sort of texture of the building with these ledges, and they sort of smooth and rough sort of moments, and kind of acknowledge this. And the building in its context. And then a very public, this is a public roof for the entire building, so it doesn't belong to the penthouse, it belongs to everyone, the sort of things that we're working on. So these are some images of the building facades as it's going up now. So you can see that this is the north facade with the larger windows. And this is some of the sort of southern facade with its smaller apertures and the trays sort of going up. And then the sort of system going up. And it's kind of great. I'm sort of very proud that I'm next to Frank. So it's me and Frank, which is very nice. With David Charles in the background. And then last project, so I think I've taken all your time, is obviously the Smithsonian, very important project for us. That took 10 years to more or less do from competition to completion. Obviously the Smithsonian, you know, is an incredible set of museums. There are 23 museums around the world. The competition was to make the National Museum of African American History and Culture, of which there are 200 museums around the country, but all of them dealing with replicas. There's been no museum that actually collected the actual artifacts of the community. The museum's mission was to create a museum that would document and show the the contribution of African Americans to the creation of America, to the identity of America, and to the idea of the American experience. It's essentially a museum that is not about the usual museography of sort of precious artifacts, but about important memories and important 20th century sort of documentation. It's, for me, really beautiful, the way in which the museum for me was a kind of moment to synthesize this relationship between the diaspora and Africa. And I always sort of showed this slide about how Nkrumah and Malcolm X were actually very close and talked very much about the sort of emancipation of black life and the edification of black life in the 20th century and the future. So some of the things that were in the museum, the first voting slip, hymn Bible, shackles, of course, gunpowder horns, etc. Things that have a provenance to do with the narrative. You know, something I love is Rosa Parks' dress, which is in the museum. And this really, for me, the museum really talking about the kind of unfolding this 400-year kind of traumatic story of the sort of extraction from West and Central Africa to South America and America. And, you know, the story is just starting. I think the museum sort of tips open the story because it's really about the relationship to the Caribbean and the relationship to South America, where most slaves went to South America. 9 million slaves went to South America, just under 3 to the Caribbean, and 500,000 to America. For me, the building being not just a kind of moment of trauma, but one about a story, and the way in which in West Africa the Yoruba celebrate the narratives, very important stories, is in the shrine houses to create caryatids that are the veranda posts of the inner sanctum of the shrines. And the shrine is the most venerated way to talk about something very important in West African culture that symbolizes a kind of moment in the society. So kings, very important kings and queens, are celebrated in the inner sanctum of the shrines. And I became really fascinated by the way in which the master craftsmen of these inner sanctum shrines would carve these incredible caryatid crowns, essentially the sort of capitals, I call them the capitals of the columns, which they talked about being influenced from Egypt, etc. The Yoruba talk about their direct relationship to Kemet, the sort of South Sudanese sort of main Egyptian kind of kingdom, and this idea of this sort of crown being a very important symbol for the kind of narratives of the then sort of figure that's been venerated. This kind of sculpture, which is this kind of highly abstracted sculpture, which influences a lot of 20th century artists in the West, is not, was first thought of as primitivist, but actually this was a deliberate move to move away from natural figuration, which the Yoruba had mastered in the 10th century. Their castings of lifelike, flesh-like figuration was already mastered in the medieval period, and they moved, as their kingdoms expanded, to abstraction, to codify the work with more information. So if you know how to read these, everything means something. And these are symbols and moments. And we sort of forgotten the kind of incredible sophistication of this time and what was happening within the kind of metropolitan sort of empire agglomerations on the continent and how that was affecting art. So there was a kind of abrupt change in the 15th century from naturalism to abstraction, which went on for about 500 years and then hugely influenced the sort of the modernism that explodes in Europe 500 years later. In making the building, not only is that narrative about the shrine very important, but in making a building which is specifically an African-American building, the narrative of African, but also of American, but the kind of definition of that being the experience of labor, felt for me to be no better expressed than in the architecture of the South and the work that was done by slaves through ironwork sort of facades. Which I'm sort of deeply fascinated by as kind of images of labor, literally sort of expressed, and also these devices that deal with the kind of specificity of the climate and the place, but create a relationship back to Africa for me in the sense of the kind of the articulated porch, the articulated veranda is the kind of way in which things work. So those two things are really the backgrounds that are working. The site is the last possible site that can be built on the mall. L'Enfant's plan is now complete. There is a fragment site here, but it's half the size, so it can't ever be a museum. It's just too small. So it might be a sort of amenities building. But now, after 200 years, L'Enfant's plan is complete, and this is the last building. It's half the size of the normal sort of museum plots, as you can see. So many people thought it was probably the worst site. It also meant the strategy would be different. Instead of being a palace horizontal building, for me, I sort of sought to make a very vertical building, which most museums will tell you is the worst way to make a museum, but thankfully with this narrative, it shifted the relationship. It's a panoptic form that registers 9 critical sort of cardinal directions and monuments in Washington: White House, Washington's Monument, Martin Luther King now, Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, the National Archive, the mall itself with its double alley trees, and the Dome of Congress. And those are the 9 elements that are encapsulated in the building's sort of lenses, as we call them, windows, as you move through the sort of narrative of the building. The building is a building within a building. It's a museum with this outer shell structure, glazed on the outside, hermetic on the inside with these lens windows, and the circulation is taken from the inside and moved to the perimeter because of those 9 kind of amazing sort of moments, so that you parade around, you sort of almost like shrine-like go around the building as you're sort of moving in and out of it. 2 sides for circulation, the other 2 sides for content, but always spiraling around it. And then finally being given a kind of very sort of prominent view which overlooks the mall and gives you this privileged sort of moment with the city. It's a 210-foot cube in plan, with its Beaux-Arts sort of plans that were started by Laurie Olins, who finished the landscaping of this part of the mall, brought in with Catherine Gustafson's team to create these desire lines that were happening on the site because it laid there for so long. We sort of mapped the desire lines which passed through the buildings, and then created a very large plaza on the back of the site. The plan is a 5-acre basement, but this part of the mall was a backfill, so it was a swamp. So it's a double-walled basement with a pump system, kind of basically continually pumping water out of this building. Back of house here, history galleries below at this point. 4 core circulations. Guy Nordson, our engineer, amazing engineer, working with us to create 4 cores that more or less principally support the entire building, cantilever and hang things off those 4 cores. The 4 cores express themselves in the sort of building. This is the sort of enclosure outside. And then there are a series of pavilions that articulate bookshops, sort of little auditoriums, ticket desks, etc., that place themselves in between it. The south has a porch, which I'll talk about in the images. You come into the space, you're able to just pass through if you wish, or you come in, and then on the west and north, the circulation happens. West, because I'm interested in the way the light works with you in that sort of from the afternoon, and north, just to have the kind of cleanest light in the main sort of atrium space, sort of descending down. Plans are very simple. We've had to kind of remove the exhibition design because we're not allowed to show it, but essentially the forecourts distribute sort of the different exhibit designs, and then the sort of offices are at the top, sort of here. So the yellow are the exhibit spaces. You can see the building going down, it's like 140 feet down into the ground. This is in scale with Washington's monument. We had to do lots of studies to make sure that this was not going to tip over once we were doing all this, which is kind of extraordinary. So there was a kind of motion sensor on this thing to do with our site, make sure we didn't take down Washington. The building section, so the museum is here on the northern side with the history galleries, and then this is the hall that you come through. There's a kind of sort of moment, a reflective sort of chamber, a little shrine, a water shrine as I call it here. Library and genealogy and offices here, and then more exhibition spaces here and offices up above. The skin of the building is now a cast aluminium, three-dimensional sort of mapping of a piece of southern ironwork. So I didn't want to design it, so we basically mapped a piece of ornamental ironwork and created a matrix from it that then we expanded and contracted and tessellated. So the move was in tessellating it to shift it to this new form, but it's really almost like a sort of ink blot. We sort of mapped it and then folded it into four to then create this new pattern, and that becomes, depending on the thicknesses, was used to sort of articulate different orientations. So this is the real facades of the building. Red is the most transparent, purple the most opaque. So the most opaque thing's happening around the 9 lenses which frame the views, and then the most transparent is where the circulation is happening or where there's a lot of inhabitation. So, and then the whole thing stops on a transparent base. These are the sort of drawings. We said I had to do these very Beaux-Arts-like drawings to really try and understand the luminosity and the density of the form, because it was very hard for the client to understand it. So we had to kind of really work, thank God for computers, to work these amazing sort of layered drawings that the teams made, which I really love. And then the building in its context in the winter. Building right there. And you can never not see it. From Lincoln's bedroom, it's very clear. I was lucky enough to go see that view. So you wake up every day as president and you have to look at the museum. The building is the little dark fellow right there. And then there he is over there. And then just from Washington's monument and that viewing tower looking down on it, it's the first gold leads building on the mall. And you realize from the street that the building is it's a solar building. I mean, obsession you can see throughout the entire work is this idea of how light works with material and form. And sort of as you approach it, this is the southern side, which is the most opaque when the sun is on it, the sort of porch, which creates the sort of the shade. It's a 65-foot cantilever on 2 columns. Amazing piece of engineering excellence by Guy and his team to allow us to not compromise this, and the client for allowing us to not sort of really compromise that form. And it's freestanding, it's not connected to the building. This is a real picture of the facade, sort of when the sun is right on it. It's not in any way messed with. And it kind of turns, it goes very dull. It goes from a very dull brown to almost a kind of on-fire gold. And then underneath the porch, you get this moment where we developed this with this water feature so that this would have a 6-degree temperature difference from the outside sun in the midday and sort of in the hottest times of the year. So you would get this very visible coolness that would happen the minute you hit the space with water ripples happening all over this because of the light reflection. And then the way and it's like the most popular place in the summer. It's literally hogged. And it's a great waiting space when the museum is full. And then the back, really for me, because sort of the stack effects kind of compensate, but then the heat gains are then released to the back. But also this kind of moment of the two sort of forms are sort of articulated at this moment with this sort of opaque and translucent sort of skin systems kind of coming together and framing the sort of journey to the memorial grounds. And then when you sort of enter, you realize that you see that it's the building within the building. This is the glass chamber and the form with these lenses that come to the windows that give you these views. And the glass chamber on the ground floor and the ability to see the 4 cardinal lights, but also to see up. And it's kind of an amazing space to just orientate yourself in the sort of ground floor of the building, and then the north entrance sort of here. And then at the north, seeing the main sort of chamber that you go down. You go down first 40 feet before you go down again, down this sort of very large stair, and then you take an elevator down to the lower sections. And this is an amazing sort of piece of engineering, again, with no column, just sort of this coiled stair that is sort of hides views. The balustrade is done so that as you go down, you disappear, and then you appear again as you come through. So it's a sort of almost like a sort of Richard Serra sculpture, so that it sort of reveals itself, and then it hides you, and then it reveals you again at the bottom. And then you go down a sort of elevator to history, and then you go down this very compressed space where you were taken back to the 14th century, and then you start the journey. And really the kind of moment of the museum is really when you get to the Declaration of Independence with Jefferson and the paradox of liberty, his slaves, and the amount of slaves that he has sort of stacked sort of behind him. And the museum is really this 3-tiered. This is Ralph Applebaum's exhibition design, working with us spatially, but the idea of the museum sort of working on these levels with the sort of the floating, what I call the sort of water shrine room, sort of hovering above, giving you hope as you kind of go through the stories, which are really deeply traumatic at times. All the artifacts are real. So in this museum, everything is real, from wedding rings, which are like broom copper, that sort of slaves used to kind of mark their relationships with each other. The segregation trains from the south, which was reconditioned and brought into the building before we closed the roof, which can never come out. Sort of taking down shotgun houses that were falling apart in the south and bringing them back and reconditioning them for people to see. That's one of the kind of beautiful things about it. So you have these 3 tiers which take you through the 3 levels of history. And you get these moments, quite reflective moments. A lot of technology is used, and sort of being able to look over as you move up. So it's a postmodern narrative. It's not a narrative that's singular. So you're always able to look back and see other things, ending sort of at the inauguration of Obama, and then you go up into a sort of moment where you can then go into the reflecting chamber, and you go through this space with this very beautiful stone that I was very obsessed with at the time from Zimbabwe, which is the stone empire, the Shona stone empire, which is this kind of space to kind of bring you into a moment where you're taken on a journey to this bronze room. So in a way, you're brought back to the Shona and stone, and then you're brought back to the Yoruba with bronze, but this is now laminated in glass. So it's a bronze weave in glass, which is then illuminated, and it's a kind of 30-foot chamber room with an oculux, which you see at the entrance, which brings lights in, but actually is a giant waterfall, sort of based on the narrative of King, to create this kind of moment based on this narrative. Which is a very important statement that Lonnie Bunch, the director of the museum, and I really sort of honed in on as the sort of the key statement about this space. The sound is overwhelming, and the idea is that it's supposed to be so overwhelming that you lose yourself and think you move out of yourself. And people gather at the top, but they can't see down, because we worked on the angle so that you couldn't look down, but you would see the water just spilling down these sort of ribs, creating the sort of cascade. So this is like people waiting but not knowing what's down there, but seeing the water going down. And this is the north entrance and looking at and waiting at that moment. And then there's a theater which sort of reverses the facade in silver and creates a kind of reverse sort of chamber. And then you rise up, and as you rise up, you get these incredible glimpses to the museum, the construction of this tiered glass system. And then the west, and the reason for the west, because you get this, whenever the sun pokes out, that you suddenly get this kind of incredible relationship to the screening system, which is a live dynamic reading of the sun as it moves, and creates a relationship for me, to the context and to the content. And then you go into the upper galleries, which are about the migration from the agrarian South to the cities and the beginning of the professional classes within the African American community, essentially. This is one of the windows which looks towards Jefferson's Dome. So this window here. Sport, etc. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of it, but military, which is a really important one, where we made this very special lens which frames the Washington's monument. When you go right up to the edge, it completely frames the view. And this was a very complicated piece of work to do. And it creates this, we had to use this angle and shift the form. And it's the only moment where on the facade there's a diagonal. People thought that, is he doing a Daniel Libeskind? What's he trying to do? Whatever. I was like, no, I'm trying to get a perfect alignment with Washington. so that you get this in the exhibition space, which is very important, so that you see the sort of black generals sort of displayed in this space. And, the first general in America is kind of contextualized with that, which is like really important. So that's why you have this diagonal on the facade. You can tell people. It's because of that twist. And if you had it straight, it would twist Washington, of course, right? And then to the upper levels, we were able to get one of these shrine figures from an amazing museum in Frankfurt, in Munich, who've loaned it to the museum for, I think, 5 years, which is really great. And it's part of the kind of top galleries, which is about the kind of explosion of culture from the urbanization of the community in all sectors. And then the view to, obviously, this is the window to Congress, which is this amazing window in this corner here. And this is the window to the National Archive. And then, there's the visual art spaces. And then the last space, which is really important, is that you get this incredible privileged view for the community at the end of the sequence to overlook the mall in a way that nobody's ever been able to see it. And this building allows that opportunity to be able to kind of see the edge of the Federal Triangle, the gardens, the oval gardens of the White House, and to really look over the entire mall right up to Arlington, which is a kind of spectacular view. And it's this privileged view that anybody can have, which is what the building's all about, this idea of enabling through the kind of understanding of the narrative. And then there's this upper terrace, which has this fantastic moment, and then the libraries, etc. So as you see people going up, these are the libraries kind of looking through the sort of system. And then just the incredible optical effects of the light, which changes all the time. And then in the evening, as the building sort of shifts, no building is allowed to be lit, so this is not special lighting. This is basically all the emergency lights brought to the perimeter, organized in a very orderly fashion, and maybe a little bit more than we need, but essentially to create enough luminosity for us to be able to turn the building to a beacon in the evening. So we're able to make the building a lantern by the design strategy, the circulation strategy, so that it glows at night as well, which is a very special part of the experience of the building. All right, thank you very much.
I
think we're going to do a question and answer, and I've gone over my time. I'm so sorry.
Thank you so much, David. We're going to need to release these people to their dinner in a few minutes and allow the theater to transform back to movies. So maybe I'll just pack two questions into one and see if it prompts some further thoughts. You did a beautiful job of bringing us into the way in these North American projects that facade components become a site of particular focus for you and your team. In materiality and making, in design and detailing. And you talked occasionally about the way local materials and local histories connect to global supply chains and global skill sets. Could you say a little bit about, beyond North America, when you're working in the UK or Moscow or Accra or elsewhere, do you find yourself adjusting that in deep ways? And then the second part is, how are you bringing the students into this in the course that you're teaching?
Absolutely. I mean, in a way, the North American sort of study of projects really gives you a kind of condensed set of scales to see the thinking that I have. But actually, when we're working in and it is to do with the way in which North America and its geography kind of are positioned on the planet. So when I'm working in the South, so in Africa, it's less about the specific facade modulation because the architecture is much more expanded because of its relationship to the equator. So the kind of climate moderation is not just at this facade, it's also at the thickening of the building. So in the work that you'll see in West Africa that's coming, it's very much about this thickened system that is articulating itself, much more kind of articulated rather than a modulated system. But for me, in my mind, it's the same thing. It's just working at different scales within it. And in Moscow, it's a kind of version of that. Again, I could have shown the Moscow project where you'd see about how that ceiling is working. But this idea of registering the idea of labor and cultural narratives into the way in which the thinking and the creativity is unfolding is a critical part about the way in which I absolutely make that operation. With my studio and my students who are probably in here with Katie, it's, we're trying to explore ways in which we can go past thinking of the facade as just a constructed artifact, that we can try and see if we can find ways to kind of engage it with narratives. Our project we're doing, which is about silence essentially, is a way to kind of switch off the programmatic part of architecture and to try and think about the sensorial and then the haptic experience of architecture as a kind of opportunity.
Great, and maybe just, I think we have 2-3 more minutes. Would you say a little bit about how you're organizing your office to tackle an increasingly broad geography and much larger scale projects ranging up from the furniture you showed to master planning?
So yes, we're working at the scale of master planning now also, but essentially the office, I decided instead of making one large office, let's say in London, to really work with studios on different continents. So most of the work in Europe, that's where the sort of office started. So London really is the sort of geographic base for the European projects. It's also become the sort of place for almost all the worldwide projects at the moment, because we don't have so many things outside of Europe. We have sort of European and sort of Middle Eastern projects, but and sort of near Asia, sort of India, etc. But the American sort of work just seems so different to the context of London that I wanted to kind of place a team directly on the continent and to grow the team on the continent, on this continent, to then work within the sensibilities that are understood here. And that was important for me as a kind of practice, to be able to also force myself to move geographically in these different continents, not just because of meeting clients, but also to experience that and to have that as part of the way in which my creativity is also affected about and sharpened by the relationship to the place. It's not back in my comfort zone sort of remembering. It's actively always engaging. And I've done the same in Africa because now we have a lot of work there. So I've sort of put myself in Accra, which is right next to the equator, a very, very different climate, but also it's my parents' home. So it's emotionally kind of important, but it's also become the epicenter of my operations in West Africa, which is strong.
Thank you very much, and thanks to you all for joining us at the Stamps Lecture Series.